years. And it was actually inspired by the college's faculty of Caucus and the college's diversity enhancement program, which we'll have a chance to hear about today from Debra Moddelmog. So again, feel free to help yourselves to some food. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Kevin Boyle, who's going to be moderating the session.
So, one sitting here. We're organizing.
And Kevin graciously agreed to do this. He just came from teaching.
No. Well, unless you guys want to just talk here? I think this is fine. We'll just do it here. Let me just say first how pleased I am to have the chance to be the moderator for today's session and to thank the organizers for putting all of this together. And I know that nobody is here to hear me, so I'll keep this really short. All I really want to do is say one quick thing, and then I'm going to do some introductions, and then I'm getting out of the way. It was actually in this room a couple of years ago, more than a couple of years ago now. I remember a discussion, and in the midst of that discussion, Hasan said something that has stuck with me. He said that democracy is hard work. And I just see this as one more bit of that hard work. It's really my honor and pleasure to introduce the panelists for today. You guys did not sit in the proper order, but that's okay. So I'll introduce you in the order they appear on the program. Sitting next to me is Hasan Jeffries. Professor Jeffries received his BA from Morehouse College and his MA and PhD from Duke University. As I think everyone probably in the room knows, he's the author of Bloody Lounge, Civil Rights and Black Power in Alabama's Black Belt. And just a couple of months ago, he received the university's Alumni Award for Distinguished Teaching. Second on our panel today is Giselle Jeter, who received her BA from Rutgers University and her MA from Ohio State. She's at work on a dissertation titled We Going To, the Children of the Birmingham Civil Rights Movement. She is also chair of the OSU Black Women's Retreat Planning Committee, and program coordinator for the Center for the Study of Teaching and Writing's after-school literacy program at Afrocentric Elementary School. Debra Moddelmog will be going third. Debra received her PhD from Penn State. She's the author of Reading Desire in Pursuit of Ernest Hemingway and Readers and Mythic Signs, the Oedipus Myth in 20th Century Fiction. She is co-founder and co-director of the Sexuality Studies program and the Diversity and Identity Studies Collective. Debra received the university's Distinguished Diversity Enhancement Award, among other awards, though it is important to note that it wasn't this year. And finally, Danielle Olden received her BA from the University of Wyoming and her MA from Ohio State. And she is at work completing her dissertation, Whiteness in the Middle, Mexican Americans, School Desegregation, and the Making of Race in Modern America. And this year, she received the university's Presidential Fellowship, its most prestigious fellowship. So, we are all yours.
So, okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's good to see a full house. Thank you very much, Kevin. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the faculty of Color Caucus for facilitating, of which I am a member, for facilitating this important conversation and dialogue. Just yesterday, I had an opportunity to listen to Dr. Freeman Hrabowski, who is the president of the University of Maryland, Baltimore College. He was speaking at the Office of Diversity and Inclusion's Conference on Diversity and Inclusion. During his keynote lunch address, noon address, he said that whenever you have a conversation about diversity and inclusion, he said it's good to begin with what's good about a particular place. He said if you begin with the bad, then it just turns into a cascade of complaints. So I got to thinking about what's good about particularly the Department of History, which is the area in which I spend most of my time. And my experience upon reflection is that individually, as a faculty member of color, as an African American, I feel very comfortable in the department. I don't feel personally, any hostility or venom towards my presence. which is a very good thing. Which is a very good, and it's not a small thing. It's a very good thing, it's not a small thing. But then I sort of hit a roadblock as I began to think about what else is really, really strong. So I'm just going to move on, and maybe we could collectively think about some other things. One of the things that Robrowski said is that very soon, 1 out of every 2 American children are going to be children of color. This is coming down the pipe. And as a university, as a department in particular, as a college, but again, as a department in the humanities, I think we have to make a decision about whether or not we want to be ahead of the curve or we want to be behind the curve when it comes to paving a way for the coming generations of students of color and of white students as well. The world, America, is a different place, and it's going to be a different place. And sadly, right now, as a department, I feel that we look more like we did years ago rather than looking like we ought to look in the current moment and into the future. I still find it somewhat depressing at the beginning, and again, speaking personally, at the beginning of every time I teach, to walk into a class, even if it's African American history class or U.S. history class, and find no more than a handful of students of color. A handful. So we can talk about, when I say a handful, I mean 5 out of 60. And when we think about this, and think about the value of the humanities in particular, the value of history and American history and U.S. history, and the importance of that to shaping how people engage the world, and the students that we have here and how they engage the world, it's a sad thing. We should be doing exponentially better at attracting undergraduates of color to the university, to the humanities, and to the Department of History. Now, the question becomes, why haven't we done better? And I think part of it is a function of vision. And this isn't about vision statements, but about vision. Right? What do we, or who do we envision ourselves as a department? Who do we see ourselves as being? I mean, do we see ourselves as being a diverse place, a place that's welcoming, a place that engages the tough issues revolving around race and ethnicity? Or are we okay with just going on as we have been? I would like to see ourselves at the forefront around these issues of how you diversify a university, how you diversify a college, how you diversify a classroom, how you engage these tough issues. We've been in the midst of, and hopefully many of you are aware, and Danielle and Giselle certainly will, I hope, will speak to this, in the midst of this troubling pattern of hate speech and hate crimes directed at students of color. You know, that's not disconnected to the absence of faculty of color on the campus. You know, the classroom is the front line on the university. We've done a very good job, and I'm sitting, a member of the No Place for Hate Task Force, the President's No Place for Hate Task Force on hate crimes, and we spent the last 3 weeks engaged in conversation and dialogue and trying to figure out what recommendations and policy changes that we can make and suggest to the President and to the board, and we've made those, and they should be filtering their way down from the President back to the board, back to us within this week, and then should be reported out in the next couple of days. And hopefully they've embraced the majority, if not all, of the suggestions that this body has made. But the classroom is the front line. And one of the things that became clear to me, sitting on this task force, is that when we look at what's out there, in terms of language, in terms of formal policy, in terms of existing bodies around diversity and how to create a diverse university, a diverse work environment, a diverse and inclusive climate. Almost everything that you could possibly imagine is written in some document at The Ohio State University. Almost everything you could possibly want exists in some form somewhere. But what I also came to realize is that although that exists on the upper echelons, in the upper administration, what we have found that it doesn't trickle down. And so as I said in the task force, what we have at Ohio State University and so many other places is trickle-down diversity. And unfortunately, it ain't trickling down because we're not seeing the results of that in our hiring practices and who we have in front of the classroom and who we have on the other side of the podium sitting in the classroom seats. So what we have to do is get serious about what we want to do. We have to get serious about what we want to do because there are entirely too many students coming at this being the flagship university, particularly too many white students, for whom they come to, for whom the Ohio State University experience is this overwhelming experience of diversity. Think about that. Next time you're in your class with those who are teaching, take a small survey. Just ask them. Take 2 minutes and ask the students. Do you think that there are a lot of students of color at Ohio State University? And almost 3/4 of them will raise their hands. Because this is their first experience. Their first experience. But it's not going to be their only experience. And so if we don't actively engage them and say, hold on, there's a whole nother world, then we are failing in our mission as a land-grant university to serve the citizens of Ohio. So we have to take seriously what the future is going to become if we want to be at the forefront of university-level education. I mean, there's no reason why in many of the instances, as we promote Ohio State University, that we don't say diversity first. That we don't say that this is a place where diversity means something, not just on paper, but in practice. And in order to get there, we're going to have some serious and hard conversations. And this gets back, this is the last thing I'll say now, I'll turn it over to my fellow panelists. This gets back to this notion of democracy is hard work. The only way we're actually going to have a diverse environment, the only way we're going to have a diverse classroom, the only way we're going to have a curriculum that reflects the strengths of diversity is if we have a hard conversation around democratic governance. If in the hiring process going forward, for example, we look at each individual candidate and not just say in the committee and during the committee process, well, what candidates of color were out there and what was the pool like. That's fine. But then when we're deciding on who to bring to campus, when we're deciding on who to vote for, we have to make a hard diversity assessment. Well, what is this person, what is this candidate going to do in terms of our overall diversity goals? Assuming we have some. Is this the type of candidate that's going to attract students of color? Is this the type at the graduate level and the undergraduate level? We don't have those conversations. Certainly not in history, but that's where we need to get. But you only have that if we have, and hopefully we'll have, this is the type of forum where we can begin this process of having real conversation, honest conversation, serious dialogue. Because in the absence of that dialogue, in the absence of that conversation, you have a breakdown in trust. And once you lose trust in the leadership, in your colleagues, then ball game over. The ball game over. Not only are you not going to be able to move forward on serious diversity issues, but you can't move forward on anything. And if you survey the department, at least in terms of the Department of History, the absence of trust, a lack of trust, I would venture a guess will be at the forefront of many people's, on the forefront of many people's minds. Because I know I've lost trust over the last couple of years, and that's a sad thing. I'll leave it there.
Okay, I thought we were going to go.
No, I am very rigid. It's an alphabetical order, and we're following.
That works. That works. Well, I would like to say I'm glad that the FCC is allowing grad students to actually sit on the panel because something that Dr. Jeffries just said about it being game over, that also trickles down to graduate students, right? The political games that are played in this department and other departments between faculty impacts graduate students on a day-to-day basis. And so I think when there's a lack of, a loss of trust among faculty members, a loss of trust in its departmental leadership, in other colleagues, that impacts our education, right? So I'm glad that you said that because I think that's something that I can only speak for myself, but I'm sure I'm not alone when I say that the political games of departments impact students all the time. So that I ask that when faculty are meeting and having discussions about who's to be hired and who's not to be hired, to think student first, right? Because that's the motto at Ohio State, right? At the Ohio State University, that it's students first. And so I ask that faculty members continue to do that, right? Put politics to the side and think about students, both undergraduates, but most certainly graduate students first. But I think I want to focus more on kind of the role of graduate students, because I think that we shouldn't let ourselves off the hook. Just because we are here getting our master's degrees or PhDs doesn't mean that we should turn off, and just kind of have this tunnel vision where we're only focusing on our research. Yes, academics should come first, and we only have a limited amount of funding, so that does put pressure on us to produce as quickly as we possibly can. But we shouldn't allow ourselves to be oblivious to what's going on around us, not only in our departments, but within the Ohio State community, but also the Columbus community at large. We're soon to be researchers, right? And if we're trying to promote change in our research, we need to also promote change on a daily basis, on a social scale. And so I charge, the graduate students who are here in this room today to ask yourself, if you're thinking about what you want to be as a professor, if you're trying to think about your future, what are you doing now to make that a reality? Right? What are you doing to help make changes in your local community where you are right now? There's no need to wait until you're, in a tenure track position, or you're making X amount of dollars. You can make changes right now in your classrooms. Talk about diversity. Make sure that your curriculum is diverse. Right? What are you talking about in your lectures? What do your lecture slides look like? What images are you using? Right? I think it's important for graduate students to think about that, because we don't always get that message from professors. Right? We need to look at what professors are doing and say, what can I do differently? Or what do I like from this particular professor's lecture today? How can I bring that into my classroom once I'm ADD and I have that opportunity? Right? Provide a space for your students that supports diversity, that includes diversity, and doesn't just tolerate it by the number of people who are in the room, right? Because we can be in spaces, and I think this room is a perfect example, where you can look at the pictures on the walls, and it's not, I don't see diversity. I don't see inclusion, right? This room has been, renovated and changed, and yet the same pictures remain. So what message are you sending by just the space in this room? These are old images, right? And it goes back to, I think, what Dr. Jeffries was saying, is that we're still, imitating and sending messages that there isn't change in this department. And I think that, I think there are other departments that could say the same thing. So I think it's important for department leadership to really think about diversity and inclusion, and not just tolerating diversity in the department. looking at it from coursework, both on the undergraduate level and graduate level, right? How are we promoting diversity among our graduate students in the classes that they're taking, classes that are required, like historiography, right? What message are we sending to our graduate students? Are we promoting diversity there? And also thinking about the climate. What does the climate look like in this department? And is it reflecting the community that is housed under this building, right? I mean, we're talking about how undergraduate students, what can they say about diversity, but what can graduate students say about it? A lot of them are coming straight out of undergrad, so they're not really experiencing anything different, right? So they're coming here with some of the same ideas that they had in undergrad, thinking that places are diverse, that having 2 or 3 students of color in your class is diversity, but yet they don't know how to interact with a graduate student of color in their own building, right? So I think it's really important for staff, for faculty, but also for graduate students to speak up and to speak about some of their concerns that they have in the department. So don't be afraid to challenge the status quo in the department, right? Don't let the threat and the fear of losing funding deter you from asking important questions, asking the tough questions, right, to department leadership, faculty, and staff. And then I think it's also important for departments to think about what is this department supposed to look like looking forward. If 1 out of 2 children are students of color, how are you going to how are you going to change the department so that it's a place that is welcoming for students of color? Not just students, but anyone, right, who has some type of diverse experience, whether it's through gender, whether it's through sexuality. There are a lot of things at play. So we need to think of diversity not just along gender or racial lines, but also in sexuality and disabilities, right? We need to think broad and not just only focus on things such as race, but that is a huge factor. And then I think, and I'm glad that the FCC put on this program, but I also think that it's important that programs such as this are not put on just by people of color, right? It's not, it shouldn't just be the responsibility of people of color to talk about diversity, right? It shouldn't just be women who talk about gender inequality. It shouldn't just be people who are part of the LGBTQI community to just talk about, sexuality discrimination, right? I think department leadership, faculty and staff need to also find ways to be advocates and be allies and not to be afraid to have these discussions, put on programs, and not leave it to the minority groups to do all of the work. So I'll leave it to the next person. Thank you.
You want to stick to the alphabetical order?
All right.
Well, I'm kind of realizing that I'm the diversity candidate here because I come from the English department, so I'm not privy to all of the conversations that you have in history, although some of that does trickle down to me. But I do want to let those of you who don't know me know that I also am co-director of the Sexuality Studies program, and as Kevin said, I am currently the director and also co-organizer of DISCO, which stands for the Diversity and Identity Studies Collective at Ohio State, which is a partnership among 8 sort of identity-based programs: African American and African Studies, Asian American Studies, American Indian Studies, Comparative Ethnic and American Studies, Disability Studies, Latino Studies, Sexuality Studies, and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. But we also, those are interdisciplinary programs, so they cross disciplinary boundaries. And so the DISCO listserv is now over 200 and growing from across the university, so it's anybody who is interested in these issues. So I just wanted you to know a little bit about where I'm coming from so that you can understand some of my remarks. I've also been here for 25 years, and this is probably the 250th dialogue I've had on diversity. And sometimes it seems like the same dialogue, and as I said to Hasan before this began, maybe this will be the dialogue that makes a difference. but I'm supposed to start positive. So let me just say, I want to make 4 points today and give you a couple of examples of those 4 points. And they're interrelated, so if they seem like they're redundant, just understand that you say democracy is hard work, I say diversity is hard work, and I know those are interrelated. But what I found in my 25 years here is that you have to really think about this issue deeply and critically. It's not simply an issue of inclusion and tolerance, as you were just saying. And so this is where I'm coming from. So the first thing, and this goes along with what Hasan said earlier, and I may be taking more of a sort of big picture view because I was also Associate Dean in the College of Humanities, and I'm right now on the Arts and Sciences Diversity Committee, and I'm also on the Presidents and Provost Council on Women's Issues on their dual career hiring and retention committee. So I'm on these different committees that are at the university level, the college level, and so I really think about it from multiple perspectives. But one of the things that I would say is that we have to make diversity a central value of everything that we do. Everything. And by that I mean hiring and retention, appointments of administrators, mentoring and professionalization, climate issues, access to resources, recruitment of undergraduate and graduate students, student services, hiring and retention of staff, research and the support that it is given, outreach and the support that it is given, and also education. I think sometimes the academic part gets lost from this equation, and I'm going to come back and hit that hard. But that has to be something that's really important. I was reading some work recently on institutionalization and how you know when something has become institutionalized. And not that it's always a good thing to be institutionalized, but I think in this regard it is a good thing to have diversity institutionalized. And there are 2 characteristics of institutionalization. One is legitimacy, and the other is taken for grantedness. It's just like, this is just part of the way we see the world, part of our vision. And I think right now we're not at the point at OSU of either of those things. And I'll give you one example of this. On the Arts and Sciences Advisory Committee to the Dean on diversity, we were charged with looking at all of the strategic planning proposals that have made the final cut. And we were charged specifically to look for diversity. Now, diversity was not a specific charge that the college gave us, who wrote these proposals, to think about. But of those 14 proposals that made the final cut, very, very few of them even mentioned diversity. And often it was something like biodiversity. So it was very discouraging for those of us who were looking for things that we could recommend that the dean support, because diversity was not even a word that was used. It wasn't even a concept. Now, I don't want to say it's true of all of them. Actually, the Humanities one did a pretty good job with some of its things. But there was one from Urban Studies, which you would think that that would be predominantly diversity, and there was not even a mention of diversity in it. So that's the kind of thinking that I think is just odd, that we don't automatically think of these things, right? And that to me means that it really hasn't become a taken for granted issue yet. The second thing that I want to say is that we have to think retention, not just recruitment. And this is where Judy wants me to talk about the diversity enhancement program that we started in the college. But the most common definition of diversity at Ohio State has been demographic, and that definition has typically fallen along gender and racial lines. We need more student, staff, faculty, and administrators who are women and or people of color. I get it. I agree with it. I'm totally behind that. We do need this. This is a matter of addition and inclusion. But inclusion without transformation that a deep and robust definition of diversity can precipitate ends with statistics, percentages, and quotas. It ends with bringing diverse people here, but not changing the conditions in which they and we work, study, think, teach, conduct research, and serve on diversity committees. It ends with recruitment, not retention, for unless we are able to create conditions in which all staff, students, and faculty can thrive, we are bound to fail or have to move on. Those people will leave us. And one of the things that I found when I was Associate Dean and I was the liaison to the Diversity Committee, which Maurice Stevens, who is in Comp Studies, was the chair of, one of the things that we found was in the college at the time, even though we had a pretty good record of diversity around racial and gender lines, we were still losing approximately 3 faculty of color from the college per year. That to us seemed untenable. It seemed like that was a really bad number. We wanted to understand more where that number came from, why people were leaving, and we also wanted to see if we could address the climate issue and try to make it more attractive for people to stay here, to make OSU a destination and not simply a stopping point for faculty. And so what we did was we started this diversity enhancement program for assistant professors of color. We had about 25 to 30 who started in the program. It began in 2006, and it was the brainchild of the diversity committee at that time that was chaired by Maury Stevens. It had 4 modules. The first module was a one-on-one mentoring opportunity where the assistant professor of color was paired with a senior faculty member. The second module was a research working group, which continues today, and so does the one-on-one mentoring. And that was an opportunity for young assistant professors to share and workshop their work in progress. The third module was a pedagogy group, and like the research group, it was open to all faculty that focused each time on different pedagogical issues specific to issues faced by faculty of color in the classroom or by diverse faculty in the classroom. And then the final thing was the Faculty of Color Caucus. And this, I think, was kind of the impetus for the History Faculty of Color Caucus. That was composed of all faculty of color in the college. They had regular meetings to discuss professional, political, and networking issues. So that was the only part of the program that was sort of a people of color only program. The rest of it was really intended to educate the entire college, people who've been in the college, about diversity, to provide a concentrated and consistent professionalization of faculty of color, a lessening of feelings of isolation in your home department. Sometimes faculty of color are the only one or one of two, so it was to bridge that feeling of isolation and bring faculty of color together. It was also to develop intellectual community. Sometimes your best intellectual contexts are not within your home department, but across the university or across the college. So that was a way of attempting to change the climate and to retain people and not just recruit them. The third thing that I want to say is that I feel, and this goes along with what you were just saying, Giselle, that we need to promote a robust and deep definition of diversity, one that expands it beyond race and gender to ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, and other social differences, and also one that examines structures of power and privilege that oppress and marginalize. The view that when we talk about people, women or people of color, we are not also talking about other kinds of diversity persists too often here. These are intersecting diversities, and when you're talking about people of color, you're talking about sexual orientation, you're talking about disability, you're talking about gender. When you talk about GLBT people, you're talking about people of color. So we have to keep remembering that these things are intersecting and that they're not isolated issues. We also have to remember that when we're talking about some of the big topics that this university is discussing, like environment, health, energy, food production, and safety, these are inherently diversity issues. They're not just issues of, one faction of our society or business or corporate issues. They are diversity issues as well. And so one of the examples that I want to give of this recommendation or this sort of point for dialogue is that we do have a social diversity requirement at Ohio State. It's a U.S. social diversity requirement, and this is the description of it. The purposes of courses, this is a GE requirement for our undergraduate students. The purposes of courses in this category is to foster an understanding of the pluralistic nature of institutions, society, and culture in the United States. Fine, good, well, and but to me, that's just suggesting let's make sure that everybody knows that there's a lot of people that are different in the U.S. Without asking, what meaning goes along with those differences? How do people survive, inhabiting those differences? And so I'm going to give a shout out right now to my colleague Pranav Jani in the English department. So, because we had a huge discussion in English recently, we are requiring our students, our English majors, going forward to semesters, to complete a diversity requirement in the department. And we had a huge discussion about what that meaning of diversity would be. And so Pranav did a great job of sort of organizing us, bringing us together, talking about this. We had difficult conversations on email and in the hallways and in the undergraduate committee. But what we finally came up with is a course that's going to be designated a diversity course must exhibit a sustained engagement with the histories and cultural expressions of marginalized and oppressed people. Now that wouldn't necessarily work for everybody, but it works for our English department. And the key things there are that it has to be a sustained engagement. It can't simply be that you're counterpointing, different groups, and that you've suddenly included a section on race in your class, and but the rest of it is all about white people. And now you have your week on, or your day, if you're lucky, on LGBT people. It has to be something that is a part of the entire course. And it also has to be classes that explore themes and texts that involve marginalized and oppressed subjects. It can't simply be just a diversification, that we really are thinking here about issues of social and cultural power that is at the heart of this diversity requirement. To me, those are two different types of classes, and I want to argue that we need more of the second kind. And then the last thing that I want to say is that we need to make academic programs and courses that are organized around this deep sense of diversity central to students' education. There's a really great study that just came out about the importance of ethnic studies to universities. And one of the things that this study showed is that approximately 6% of high school students who come to the university have had some kind of diversity education in high school. That is not a very big percentage. And so it's understandable that when they come to our classrooms, they're shocked, especially the white privileged students, that they're shocked and think, oh my God, all they talk about at Ohio State is diversity, because they haven't had that sort of background before. The other thing that the study found is that the first time that a white student takes a diversity class, they tend to be very emotionally upset, and especially if they've come from a privileged background, emotionally upset, maybe resistant, angry about it. The second time they kind of get it. And so it's not enough to just give one diversity course and say, okay, now we're done, you've got your diversity education. We really need to think about this as a holistic and continuous experience. And I want to emphasize the importance, and now I'm going to maybe give out a sort of promotion for DISCO. I want to emphasize the importance of the academic programs that are set up to do this. This study also showed that university students notice and react to whose knowledge is represented in the curriculum. Based on the survey they did, they found that students, and especially students of color, judge the extent to which their university values diversity primarily based on the willingness to integrate diverse racial and ethnic perspectives into the curriculum. While students saw extracurricular activities as important, whose perspectives are in the university curriculum was the most important factor they used to assess the campus's commitment to diversity students. I think the programs that are central to DISCO need to be foregrounded. We need to make something out of this. We need to advertise it. We need to make it central to the university's diversity mission. So anyway, those are the 4 things I wanted to say. So thank you.
Well, yes, thank you again to the FCC for organizing this, and to all of you who have come. This is really nice to see so many people here. I'm going to talk about a couple of different things, I guess, and I guess I'll start here. And those of you who have heard me speak before or have heard me complain about this before, you've heard this. But like Kevin Boyle said, I come from Wyoming. That's where I was born and raised. I went to the University of Wyoming. Wyoming is possibly the least diverse state in the entire country. But I have to say, yeah, possibly. I have to say, though, that my experience at the University of Wyoming was much more diverse than what I see here at Ohio State. I've been here for 5.5 years now, so I've seen, a lot. And when I first got here, I was really sort of shocked at the lack of diversity. When I was at Wyoming, I would walk across campus and I would see lots of different types of people in the union, which is obviously much smaller than this gigantic corporate building that we have here. But I would see so much more diversity. I would see more diversity in my classrooms. And so when I got here, that's what I was expecting it to be. Oh, this is Ohio. And granted, I didn't know anything about Ohio. But I thought this is going to be so much, I'm going to get to see so much more. And I really, really didn't. And it was, I think, maybe the first thing that I noticed. When I got in the classroom, both, as a TA and then when I'm teaching my own class, I walk in and that's the first thing that I see as well. And you're absolutely right, a handful of students tops, right? In a class full of 50, we're capped at 50 students, so I might have 2 or 3 students of color in my classroom, and that's absolutely not okay. As a graduate student, I'll talk a little bit about my experience as a graduate student taking coursework. I went back and tried to think about, you know, all the different classes that I've taken and who I've taken classes from, and so I think I got this right. I've taken graduate classes from, I believe, 6 women total in all of my graduate education, and 4 people of color, and all were in the Department of History. And then I got thinking about why I had 6 women and 4 people of color in my coursework, and I realized that much of that has to do with my own particular interests, right? What I'm interested in researching and what are my scholarly interests. And, you know, that's where all those people came from, right? It's entirely likely that if I would have been in a different area, right? So I'm in modern U.S. history. I have interests in African American history, Latino history, you know, comparative race history, women's and gender history. So those are the classes that I'm taking, and that's why I was taking classes from women. That's why I was taking courses from people of color. If I would not have been in those particular classes, it's entirely likely that I could have made it my entire graduate career at Ohio State and had a class from maybe 1 woman and no people of color at all. At this giant research university, I just think that that's outrageous. And then I got to thinking about diversity among graduate students, and you know, that's lacking, as we know, as well. And I've had this conversation with Leslie before. You know, if it wasn't for the women's history field, if it wasn't for the African American history field, the diversity in the department would be absolutely dismal. There wouldn't be the very few people that we have who are people of color. It's just a fact. And then I think about, okay, well, those are the 2 fields mostly where these people are coming from. It seems to me that what I've seen in the last 5.5 years here is that those fields aren't genuinely valued by large segments of this department. You know, I've heard conversations in the TA offices. I've heard conversations among faculty in faculty meetings. I've heard conversations among people in committee meetings, in various committees that I've been on in the last couple of years. And some of the conversations are really quite stunning, right? This idea of tolerance but not inclusion, right? And for those of you who don't know, Giselle and I are both involved in this new sort of movement on campus, Ohio State Stand Your Ground. And there are 3 demands that have come out of this movement. One was to get hate crime alerts. The second was to increase the diversity among faculty and students at Ohio State. And the third demand is that we demanded inclusion, not just tolerance, at the university. And that one really, really resonated with me, in particular because of how I felt my experience in this department has been. And that has very much been, okay, we accept that, you know, there are people of color here, or there are, you know, other types of minorities in the department. We accept that, you know, you're here. And again, the rhetoric is very much, we want that, we want to go out and recruit diverse faculty, diverse graduate students, but that trickle down that you're talking about isn't happening. And it really got me to thinking that, you know, it's really about what the department values, right? What is the culture like in the department? And I feel like, you know, and I talk about the department because that's really where most of my experiences are at, but I suspect that it's similar in a lot of other departments at the university. And so the university at large really doesn't value diversity, like you were saying, in all segments, right? It's not just something that we say we value. It needs to be at the forefront of everything that we do, and that's not really happening. In terms of graduate students, and something you said resonated with me as well, you know, the few people of color who are in this department don't feel welcome, flat out. I mean, I've had conversations with people, and, you know, people don't even like to go into the TA offices. Don't even like to go in there because of the conversations that we hear on a daily basis. A genuine lack of concern among some people in the offices for issues of diversity or issues of inclusion. And even at least I felt this, and I'm sure that other people have felt this, you know, feeling a pushback from a lot of people, a resentment, right? Oh, the FCC and those people over there are making a ruckus again. You know, now we got to deal with this for another couple weeks, but it'll die down again and we can go back to normal. And then, oh, here we go again, right? A genuine sort of resentment is what I feel from some people. I've been in this building, up in the graduate lab, and you know, I'm not gonna say names. I'm not gonna call people out or anything, but I've heard other graduate students talking blatantly about how the women's history field isn't a valid field. It's not historically legitimate, and the department should not be giving so much, you know, resources to them. We should not be hiring in that field. It's not a legitimate field, right? Things like oral history aren't legitimate historical practices. Well, who uses oral history, right? And so it's things like that, you know, that maybe don't mean a whole lot if they're isolated, but it's not isolated, right? These are the type of conversations that happen all the time, and why certain people don't necessarily feel welcome in a department. And then I wanted to shift just a little bit to talk a little bit more about SYG, since I stand your ground, since I think people wanted to know a little bit about that. So this is a document that was put together by several of the people who are on the task force, faculty and staff, and you should know that most of the leaders in this movement are from the history department, in terms of both faculty and graduate students. A lot of us are from the history department. It's really quite amazing, and you have to ask yourselves, why? Why do students in history, why do faculty in history feel like this is something that we have to be involved in, right? And so this document was put together, and it's sort of a list of demands that we think should be included. The task force that met is supposed to be coming out with a document here in the next couple of days, correct? That is going to be the document that is given to President Gee and to the Board of Trustees as well. Recommendations on what should be done to address the demands that SYG has made. And there's you know, this is a really great document. But a couple of things I wanted to point out to you, and just so we have some data. I mean, you're absolutely right. A couple of you said this, that most of the white students who come from Ohio suburbs have no experience with diversity. And so when they come to the classroom, if you ask them how many of you think Ohio State is diverse, they absolutely will raise their hand, because they think it is, right? Well, here are just some numbers, all right? Currently on the Columbus campus, African American students make up 5.8% of students. 5.8% out of, what is it, 50-some thousand students? That's really, really low, okay? So 5.8%. Latinos currently make up 3.1% of the Columbus campus. 3.1%. Asian Americans are 5.3%. And American Indians currently make up 0.2% of the Columbus campus. And so I wanted to point out the Columbus campus in particular, because one of the things that we're getting told is that these numbers aren't correct. Like, well, if we look at Ohio State as a whole, these numbers are actually a lot larger. That's because a lot of these students are on the regional campuses. Yep. And why is that? It's because the entrance requirements are different than for the Columbus campus. And so the university as a whole can say that they're doing much better in terms of diversity. But when we look at Columbus, and that's where we all are sort of living and working and studying, it's a lot more dismal than we think, right? So I wanted to just point that out as we think about you know, the need for diversity and the people who think we don't really need to do it. This is really, really low. And the other thing that I really liked out of this document was some recommendations in terms of hiring. And I thought that our department in particular, because again, that's where my experience is at, should see some of this. All right, so these are some of the recommendations. That departments would have to create a diversity goals report, right? So again, a lot of this is administrative work, that some of it has already been done, it's just not being implemented, right, to the extent that it should be. So there should be some sort of diversity goals report. There should be diversity goals assessments done by each department, also done by the college in however 3, 7, or 10-year terms. This should address faculty and student retention. This should address what classes are being offered, so what is the curriculum that is being valued by the department. Every aspect of department life has to be measured against these diversity goals. So again, it's about everything that we do, right? It's not just about numbers, it's not just about quotas or statistics, it's about valuing diversity in everything that we do. And so I won't go into any more of this. I'm willing to share this with people who want to see. But I guess the point I wanted to make there is that it's sort of what is just to echo what other people were saying, and that is that diversity needs to be a part of everything that we do. The one thing that I think is a little bit lacking in this report is graduate education, right? And I think that that's something that the department lacks on a little bit as well. And that has to do with the types of courses that are offered, the faculty that students have to choose from, right? If you're in particular fields in this department, you know, when you're thinking about who's going to be on your committee or who are you going to take classes from, you often don't have the choice to take classes from diverse faculty members because there are no diverse faculty members in those fields. In terms of the curriculum that is required, right? The historiography class is, to my knowledge, the only required course that everybody has to take. But something that we talk about a lot is the fact that this class is often taught from a very Eurocentric model, right? And we've both been privy to conversations in that class that have been offensive, right? I know someone this very year who was enrolled in historiography, and there were conversations in that class about whether certain fields were legitimate fields of history. Again, the same questions that I overhear all the time, right? And that person was sort of scared to speak out and say, well, wait a minute, I do that, what are you talking about, right? Because there was nobody there to back them up, okay? And so it's a question about culture and what kind of culture that this department is creating and what it values, right? And again, I don't mean to bash on the history department, that's just where I have my experience in, and I'm sure that other departments at the university have experienced similar things. So I'm happy in the question and answer session to talk more about my experience as a graduate student, but also about SYG if you have particular questions.
We have, I think, about half an hour left for discussion, questions, comments, so we're all yours. I will just call on people. Or maybe not.
Could I just follow up on something that Danielle just said? The Diversity Advisory Committee to the Dean recommended the diversity goals and assessments that you all were talking about. And the other thing that we discussed is helping departments to understand that when you form search committees, they are not screening committees. They are search committees. Like lots of times we just sit back and say, okay, let's just see what kind of applications we get, and then we'll choose from that pool. But a real search committee goes out and invites people to apply and makes it clear in their job ad that they welcome, certain types of fields, subfields, not just that you welcome a diverse population, but that you are welcoming to certain fields that would perhaps bring in that diverse population.
Usman.
Well, I would like to express my gratitude, that of the FCC, to members of the panel. I would like to ask Debra to address the issue of pedagogy, education. And I want to do this in the context of my own experience, a statement that a student made on SEI form during my second year here. A student remarked that this professor is awesome. This is a very good example of affirmative action. A sort of positive acceptance of me in the classroom. And I look around, I could suspect who wrote this. I mean, you can, if you give students assignments, written assignments, you can always go back and look at the handwriting who this came from. But it really alerted me to the fact that we don't adequately educate students when they come into classroom, that when they, members of, faculty of color are not here because of affirmative action, that they be scrutinized like anyone else, and that they have to get that myth out of their minds. And I wonder if in the course of, let's say, student orientation when they come in, do we really give them information that would not make them feel that diversity is a threat to their own existence? Do we address this issue in orientation? I had to do that when I was in Wisconsin. We included that as part of student orientation, find ways of bringing speakers to address this issue so that students don't see faculty or other students of color on campus as a threat. Because I think issues of diversity fall through the crack because there are some who actually see it as a threat to their own existence. That something is being taken away from them and given to people who are not qualified.
I unfortunately don't know exactly what kinds of orientations students get. I'm not involved with that. I was never involved with that. But one of the things I could say about what you just talked about is that that kind of response reminds me that one of the things we really have to pay attention to is educating P&T committees about how to read evaluations of faculty of color and other kinds of diverse faculty. Because students respond in ways that are totally inappropriate, and if you don't know how to read that, then you can end up penalizing a faculty of color because you're comparing evaluations to ones that come from white faculty that maybe don't have to deal with the same kinds of issues. That particular example, I would think that any P&T committee would say, well, that's ridiculous that student even said that. But there are other kinds of examples that are more subtle, and you have to know how to read between the lines. You have to really understand that teaching evaluations can actually be lower for faculty of color, even though they're doing exactly the same thing in the class and teaching the same material, simply because it was unconscious prejudices and assumptions.
If I could just toss in one kind of addendum to that, I think that same dynamic also applies to faculty members who are not native English speakers or who bring any sort of non-American accent into the classroom. Bob?
Let me just respond to Osman's point, because I think it's an important one, and it really is one of the hard questions I think we need to address. Because as I listened to all of you speaking, all of you were making a case, although you didn't use that term, for affirmative action. You were saying that diversity should be one, maybe even the most important consideration to take into consideration for admissions decisions, for hiring decisions. And so in that sense, to look at, in that sense, you're calling for affirmative action, are you not? Or is it just that there's a stigma attached to that term and you would prefer to use a different term, which is fine. But it does seem to me that the whole concept of affirmative action from its history is that you should take positive action in order to create the goal of a more diverse workforce. So then what is the word you would prefer us to use? And why should there be a stigma attached to affirmative action?
Well, I mean, one, part of it is getting caught up in the legalese of it, right? I mean, so a lot of it has to do with, the Michigan case and moving away from concepts, the language of affirmative action, and towards this idea of diversity, right? Now, that being said, I mean, so you will find, look, the President of the United States hasn't uttered the two words affirmative action his entire presidency, right? I mean, he will mention diversity. You have a case coming up out of Texas that is now challenging whether diversity itself, right? Now, look, I have my own issues with the notion of diversity, right? In the sense that what we're saying is we want to look forward, right? And forget about the reason why the question of the absence of diversity is even a problem, So when you're talking about affirmative action, you know, me, Hasan Jeffries, I have no problem with affirmative action. Like, that's exactly what we need, right? But given the political climate at the time, you're not going to get Gordon Gita utter the words affirmative action or anybody else because it's so politically charged. That being said, and there's also, you know, there's some legal issues now revolving around what you can do and how you can do it. That being said, we should not allow sort of the fear of what might come about if we move positively to create a more diverse classroom, diverse university. For example, if we want more graduate students of color, or in this particular instance, more African American graduate students, from my perspective, then we need to ask the question, well, in 5 years, how many black PhDs do we want to produce? We can ask that question. We can set that as a goal. But we have to be serious about, one, wanting that as a real objective. And then move towards policies that embrace that. So if we want to talk about diversity, then we absolutely need benchmarks. Now we can call that diversity and being more inclusive. We can call it affirmative action. We can call it just change, positive change, right? To create the kind of classrooms, the kind of university that is more reflective of the world in which we live and the world that we are moving towards. You know, the other thing is, you know, this notion of 1 in 2 children, you know, are soon going to be, you know, 1 in 2 American children are going to be children of color. The kids is coming. Whether we like it or not, they're coming. So we either go about, as a university, as an institution, we either be aggressive and recruit and bring them in, the very top, because they're going somewhere. They're going to be here. So now, but I also do think we need to have in this conversation, we shouldn't forget the reason why we're in the situation we find ourselves to be in today. And I think that's what's lost when with the shift to diversity as opposed to affirmative action. But we shouldn't let that keep us from setting real goals and benchmarks. And that's not quotas. That's not pushing anybody else out. That's saying we can do something different. We can do something special. But we have to have real objectives and real goals, and then work towards those goals and objectives.
My
I guess I have 2 points. One, to add on to what Hasan is saying. In the years that I've been here, and I think many of you will have heard this too, I've really been disturbed by the extent to which diversity and excellence are set in opposition to each other. That either we can be diverse or we can be excellent. And I think that's sort of what's underlying this comment that Usman got on his SEIs, which is, wow, you know, he's both not white and he's excellent. Who knew? You know, and I think, I'm not, and this is, I'm sort of inviting everyone to speak about this, that I think, to me, I think this is one of the sort of major obstacles within, I guess, departmental culture and in terms of the College of Humanities, that although we've been hearing that message from some folks on a consistent basis, we're often hearing the opposite in practice. And I think that's just something I wanted to put out there, whether you call it affirmative action or diversity. The other thing I wanted to think about, because we decided to call this dialogue about diversity and democracy, and to sort of kind of reintroduce that into our conversation, because I think we have, and I felt this since I arrived at Ohio State, that we have an extraordinary faculty in the humanities and in the history department, and yet we sometimes seem to be less than the sum of our parts. And I've really been thinking about why that's the case, and I'm more and more thinking about the fact that a lack of sort of democratic governance, sort of democratic participation in the life of the department and in the college and the university leads a lot of us to disengage, right? I mean, going back to what Hasan was saying earlier, you know, I would hate to do that. And yet I think a feeling of a lack of inclusion and a hierarchical culture sort of lead a lot of us who have, many of us who have a lot of contributions to make, to wonder whether our energies need to be invested in making those contributions together. I think that's a retention issue. I think it's a departmental culture issue. I think it shapes the messages that our graduate students are receiving. So I just want to put that out there as well for folks to take up.
I wanted to ask this question, and it's in complete solidarity with OSU Stand Your Ground. I love the organizing is happening. My question is why hate crimes as a like a title? I mean, when I hear that, it's like,
I'm sorry,
why ask for like hate crime alerts? Like why term it hate crime? I mean, that's a really strong word. And like hate crime, the whole entire history of hate crime legislation is like tied to the criminal industry, penalization. Like it conjures like going to the cops, getting alerts. It just conjures the whole thing that we're trying to organize and move away from. So that's my in complete love and solidarity. Yeah.
I actually wasn't here. I was at a conference when this whole thing started and when the list of demands was made. So you can maybe speak to that original conversation. But my understanding is that that was one of the first demands because there were several people who came together who felt genuinely unsafe in response to the initial thing, which was the spray paint on the Hale Center, Long Live Zimmerman, who felt genuinely unsafe and like they were being threatened and intimidated, and especially after the incident that happened the night before. I mean, this didn't happen in a vacuum. This was the night after a vigil was held on the Oval, a peaceful vigil, and a gentleman showed up, another student showed up wearing an empty gun holster. He is from a campus group called Buckeyes for Concealed Carry. They pushed the administration to allow guns on campus, obviously, as the name implies. Since then, my understanding is that that was some sort of day-long protest that they were involved in. It was nationwide to wear the empty gun holster. But he did show up to this event. Again, I wasn't there. My understanding is that he was very erratic, was pushing through people, was seeming to be intimidating to people. It was getting dark out, so people saw the gun holster and didn't know if there was a gun in it. And so that happened, and then we wake up to find out that the one space that African Americans have on campus, the Hale Center, was defaced with this Long Live Zimmerman thing. And so people genuinely felt like they were being threatened. And that, and again, this was in response to the fall. Remember what happened in the fall with all of the crime alerts that were going out that were very racialized, that included no information that would help somebody deter being, walking in an area that there were robberies in, other than black, white male robbed another white student. And the thing with those is that, if my understanding is correct, that there actually wasn't an increase in robberies. I mean, there are robberies all the time in that just east of High Street area of campus. The numbers didn't change, but they started sending out these alerts for whatever reason, and it started to scare people. And conversations that I heard around campus were very racialized in response to that. And students protested that. Why are these going out like that? You're raising people's fears and, again, raising this question of black criminality all over again. They ended up tweaking slightly the way that they sent them out. But we didn't really see any more, actually. It's almost as if they just stopped sending them out in response. And so then this happened. And, again, these students felt genuinely unsafe. And so the idea was others, if we're going to be warned about potential danger situation, we should also be warned about this potential danger situation because we should know what's happening, and that's why. Maybe you can speak a little more clearly to the language.
I think being informed is something that's really important because a lot of times hate speech happens on this campus all the time. Every year, hate letters are sent to Moral Tower, which is a learning living community for African American students. It's kind of this annual anniversary. The students expect it, and I mean, a part of it, some of us joke because it's like, well, it's about that time for the letters to come flowing in, but oftentimes it goes unnoticed. And when what happened at the Hale Center, President Gee he had on his website, under speeches, he posted his response to what took place at the Hale Center. Now, mind you, he'll send out an email to the entire university saying Happy Valentine's Day, right? But you have, the Hale Center is defaced, and you have to search. You have to go to his website, then find a link in order to find his response to what took place. So students were asking, I mean, I think there's probably still students on this campus who have no idea what happened at the Hale Center. So the reason why they put together this hate crime alert is so that students can be informed about what's going on their campus. The campus, they paid their parents pay tuition. I mean, I think students need to be informed. And I think the language, while there might be some issues with it, I still think it's important because it's sending a message, right? It grabs people's attention that there's not just crime alerts, but there's hate crime alerts, right? And it's tied to race, gender, religion, sexuality, sexual identity. And so I think, while yes, there are issues with it, I still think that it's important. I think even there should be one that specifies just hate speech, right? Because hate speech and hate crime can be considered, sometimes something different. But I think, again, it's important for students to be informed of what's going on at The Ohio State University, where it's students first, right? Students need to know what's going on.
And just one more thing. The reason it's hate crime, the reason we decided on that is because vandalizing is a crime, right? And it was a hate message. So it's a crime that included a hate message. So the idea was this is a hate crime.
Tony.
Tony Gass, 7th year PhD candidate. As Danielle said, I'm also a part of State Now. I'm on the advisory committee. And I just want to make a comment. First, again, giving thanks to the SEC and the panelists for this informative discussion. But one of the things that I experienced in the years, it's been 2 years since I've taught in the department, I've had an assignment in the department. And one of the things that I found, I let students know at the beginning that I'm not going to teach the standard narrative, meaning I'm not just going to simply talk about dead rich white men. I tell them at the beginning of class, I'm going to include Asians, Native Americans, immigrants, poor and working class whites who I feel sometimes are left out of the narrative as well, in addition to African Americans being African American male. And I try to, incorporate and include them as much into the narrative to where it seems like I'm not just punching them in here or there. I try to make it seamless. And one of the things I inevitably get on my evaluations afterwards is someone, maybe 2 or 3 people will say, I thought this was a U.S. history class, not an African American history class. Even though I don't think I speak about black folks any more than I speak about anybody else. And I don't know if that's because I'm an African American male and they never experienced African American males before, particularly in an authority position, because some students have said they've never seen a black person in real life unless they're on TV, and most of their starting point is Flavor of Love or things of that nature. So when they see a black male that smacks against that stereotype, they're shocked. One of the things I also found, as Dr. Jeffries and others have alluded to, when the handful, I can count the number of black males that I've had in my classes over 4 years of teaching. I can count them as 5 in 4 years of teaching. That when I ask my black students, the few that I get, where they're from the urban areas, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Columbus, Dayton, Toledo. When I ask white students, Bucyrus, Lancaster, to where I have to ask them, what does that mean? Where exactly are you? What urban area are you from? That I can, give a point of reference to. And again, a lot of them are coming not having interactions with people of color, much less African Americans, which again surprised me, thinking of the little that I know from Ohio. Again, my reference points are the major cities. So coming up against that, white students who, again, have never seen a person of color in real life that they can touch, that they can talk to, that they can interact with, was a shock. And that's in terms of teaching. In terms of the department here, one of the things I find is the hostility toward my field is mostly expressed towards black women. Jason, Bennett, and myself, most of the black men in the department that I interact with, we don't come across a lot of the hostility and the illegitimacy of our field. Most of that has been expressed to the black women in the department, to where in some instances they feel threatened, they feel unsafe with some of the comments, and some of the out-and-out blatant comments. I mean, some of these are not just conversations that you happen to hear. These have been said directly to them in both the TA office and in classrooms, and in some instances, the professor in that classroom does not interject and say to that student, or investigate why that student feels that particular way. one particular female was told, the question was asked, why do why are you in the field that you're in? And she, of course, was in African American history and made some personal reference, also some historical reference. And one student said, that's not a good reason. But nobody else was questioned. No European, white student was questioned about why they do European history, or why they do U.S. history, or Asian students were questioned why they do Asian history. But a black student who does African American history was questioned why she did that. And then her reasons were considered illegitimate. So again, that's some of the climate that has taken place in this department, to where, in some instances, this is not my orbit anymore. I choose to dwell in a different orbit. And again, that's not even from personal experience, but because I'm in solidarity with the people that I'm in solidarity with, I choose not to, keep myself in those spaces, because I'm not one to keep my mouth quiet. If there's some ignorance going on, I'm gonna attack that ignorance. It might not be the best response, so I decided to keep it quiet. So that's my own personal comment on the climate, both in the classroom and here in the room.
I think something important to say about that is, not only am I African American, but I'm also Puerto Rican, right? And so I think sometimes people fail to realize that there are allies in the room. So while they may not say something about African American people who are studying African American history, they may say something about students who study Latino or Latina history, not understanding that I'm someone who identifies, right? Or someone, people will make comments about, gender. Last time I checked, I was a female. Or, so people don't realize that just because you may not be a person of color doesn't mean that you're not an ally. You can be equally disgusted and disappointed at what, things that are being said. And I think you hit a really important point about faculty members not being equipped to respond, right? I don't know if faculty members really know what to do when things like that happen, whether or not some of them may agree with what students are saying, but I think some of them may be uncomfortable and not know how to address these issues. And I think it's important for department leadership to not just wait for a diversity committee to draw up a document and say, okay, this is what we need to do. There are things that a department can do right here, right now to say, for next year, we want to look at diversity training for our faculty, because they need to understand how to address diversity issues beyond just race, right, beyond just gender, and to make it so it's a safe space for students, both undergraduate and graduate, and so that students feel like faculty members are allies.
I don't want to cut things off, but there is another class, or there is a class, in this room, I'm afraid, at 1:30, and I think that we really...
Can we take one last question?
Sure. Alison, you get it.
My question, I think, maybe brings together a couple of things. Not really a question as much as an observation from a bit of a different perspective. The term diversity, I love the term diversity, but I also think that it's not a static thing, it's a relationship. Listening to Danielle talk about and hearing the rhetoric of not just tolerance but inclusion, that's very hard for me sometimes to get my head around, and I was thinking how to think about that, and I remembered an experience when I was an undergraduate at Smith College, when we started a bulletin board with pictures of guys that we thought were attractive on the wall, and it was a mixed race dormitory, and people started to get upset, people of color got upset that there were no pictures of black men up there, and now it would be an issue of women and men, and not just putting men up there at Smith, which is probably a good thing. But we said, well, put them up there. Just put them up there. You're here. Put the pictures up. And they said, and I don't think I really understood this until I was in graduate school. And I realized they said, we don't want us to have to put the black people up because we're black. We want you to include African American men in your vision of what's attractive. And that's, maybe that's not what you're getting at, but that's, to me, it's about reshaping the way you think. And this diversity conversation needs to be a dialogue. And I think there are a lot of different things. I hear absolutely two different things here. There's hostility in those graduate TA rooms, which concerns me really, really deeply. This all concerns me deeply, or I wouldn't be here. And then there's a faculty climate, which I think is it's a more quiet problem. And we don't know how to talk about it. We don't understand sometimes from the perspective that we come from that the fact that we only put up the white men on the board is exclusionary. We don't understand that other people don't feel welcome because we haven't had a conversation about it. And that conversation I had with the women in my dormitory at Smith was really profound for me, and it shapes the way I think about things. And maybe if we can think about this as a conversation that we really need to have, because diversity, I bring diversity, you bring diversity, diversity isn't different people, it's everybody in conversation together. And maybe that's too idealistic, but to me the goal should be a conversation. And I just wanted to say thank you for opening this discussion, because we really need to have this discussion in the department, really obviously. So it's very hard sometimes to shift the way you see the world. And you don't even know you have a blind spot, and then someone says it, and sometimes you push back against it. But then you figure it out eventually.
Well, and again, thank you very much. And that is really the key point. That I think if we're going to have these conversations, they can't be for an hour and a half in the room. It's got to be something that pervades the department. And I hope that you will continue to have them. But I really do have to turn the room over to the next court. So thank you all very much.